Hello and welcome to Doc Aviv 2021 at the Cinematheque around Tel Aviv and online. My name is Laliv Melamed and I'm thrilled to be here with the director and participants of Ala Kaye, which is screening in our Beyond the Screen program. Ala Kaye is available online until July 10th. שלום וברוכים הבאים לדוק אביב 2021 בסינמטק ברחבי תל אביב ואונליין. אני לליב מלמד ואני מתרגשת מאוד להיות כאן עם היוצרים והמשתתפים של לרחובות, שמוקרן במסגרת פרס מעבר למסך. לרחובות זמין אונליין עד ה-10 ביולי.
Hello, I'm Max Caicedo, one of the film's directors and producers.
I'm Federica Davila. I'm one of the characters in the film. I'm 27 years old. I currently live in Caracas, Venezuela, and I'm a doctor in the public health system.
Hi, I'm Tamara Tarasiuk-Mroner. I'm the America's Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch, and I've been covering the situation in Venezuela for many years now, and I participate in the film as one of the experts interviewed for the movie.
Thank you, all of you, Max, Federica, and Tamara, for joining us. We watched the film with basically holding our breath. You described to us there's so much at stake with the situation, and I wanted to start actually by maybe start where the film ends and ask you what's the situation today in Venezuela. What's how what you portray throughout the film, how it kind of like further evolved since you stopped shooting.
Maybe I can start. Since we've been looking at the situation for quite some time, I think the film does a wonderful job highlighting the key issues in Venezuela that continue to be key issues today. And I would mention three. One is the crackdown on dissent and the political persecution of opposition members. We continue to see that in Venezuela, not only against political opponents, but against anyone who dares to criticize the government. And that includes doctors, human rights activists. Currently, today, they've just detained 3 human rights defenders who document conditions in the border of Venezuela and Colombia. And so this is an ongoing problem in the country. Second, the humanitarian emergency, and Federica can talk more about the terrible situation in hospitals in the health system. What I would say is that we had documented a complex humanitarian emergency with increasing child malnutrition rates and enormous problems for the health system before the pandemic. So, things have only gotten worse since then. And finally, I would highlight as a third point, the refugee crisis. Venezuela is a country that used to be a democracy, hosting people fleeing dictatorships in other countries in South America. And today it's expelling its people. The number of Venezuelans who have fled has raised to more than 5.6 million people. That is more than almost 20% of the entire Venezuelan population. This is huge. It's an enormous amount of people that poses enormous challenges, not only for the Venezuelans who are fleeing to get access to legal status, access to healthcare, to work permits in other countries, but also for the host countries receiving them.
Max, do you want to add something to the?
Honestly, it's with these types of questions, Tamara definitely knows the most about the current situation on the ground. I will say that it's interesting because in the wake of COVID and in the wake of a lot of these other issues that have been going on, what's been happening in Venezuela has only continued to evolve and morph in ways that have been exacerbated by these sort of the pandemic and these larger issues. But because so much of the sort of newsreels and so much of the international media focus has been around more each country's respective challenges with regard to the pandemic, what's going on in Venezuela has kind of, there was a point where it was reaching the news headlines with relative frequency, and kind of was pretty fresh in people's minds, but that has kind of waned a little bit, which is unfortunate because the situation has only compounded more and more over that time, especially with the pandemic. So it's I guess from a public visibility perspective, it's only gotten worse, even though maybe the broader public has sort of not been able to see as much of that in their daily interaction with media.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned that in a way the pandemic is not just that, kind of like, this parachuting of an external crisis on a country, but it's kind of like exacerbating what was already what was already collapsing in a way. And it maybe Federica, you can say a little bit more about it, because we see it in the film that in terms of infrastructure, in terms of social infrastructure, the country is always struggling, right? There is lack of basic products, there is lack of services such as medical services. Some of them are completely essential to the larger population. So Federica, maybe you can add a reaction on what's happening on your side in terms of the health crisis in Venezuela.
Yes, the pandemic has hit hard everywhere. I mean, I believe that it has struck every country in the world in a way that's been really hard to handle. We were not prepared for this, but in Venezuela, I think it's harder because we already had a collapsed health system. Our public health system, which is the one that most Venezuelans have to get into when they get sick, was already broken. We have not much to offer, but the pandemic made it really harder because we don't have enough beds, we don't have medicine at all. And what we can offer to our patients is basically the knowledge that we have acquired during our careers. Because when someone gets in and we don't even have the most basic medicines to treat the most basic conditions. Imagine a patient with COVID, really, really sick, needing a ventilator, and we cannot offer things that we don't have. So it's really hard for us as doctors to receive these patients, and we really have nothing to offer.
I wanted to ask, because Federica, we're being introduced to you when you're still a student, is that correct?
Yes.
So I wanted to ask a little bit, before we go back to kind of like the overall situation in Venezuela, I wanted to ask you a little bit question about, first of all, how did you meet each other, Tamara and Max? How did you meet Federica, or Federica, how did you meet Tamara and Max? And also, it strikes me that the film was shot over a relatively long period. So if you can say a little bit about also the process of shooting the film, how long did it take? How much were you involved in your protagonist's life? For instance, Federica is here with us today, and is able to also offer like a longer reflection on the situation. So if you can talk a little bit about this.
Well, yes, I was a student when we first met. I am one of the founders of an NGO in Venezuela. It's called the Green Cross. At the time, I was the director. I have now stepped down and I'm working on other things in my career, but I'm currently one of the volunteers. And we were on the streets while the protests were going on in Venezuela. We were helping the people that got injured because we were a team of students and doctors, of medical students, of course, and doctors who went to the protests and were there basically to support and give medical attention to the people in need. So Max and his team contacted us because they wanted to record what was going on the streets. And we started filming and shooting, and they were like all the time with me. They went to my house, we had lunch, they went with us to the protest. They were like all the time following us.
Yeah, and kind of jump on that a little bit. When we first started to make or come up with how to approach the issue of what was going on in Venezuela, what we kind of set out to do was identify what the largest issues of the country were, and then try to find individuals who could represent or give us insight into those issues, right? So when you look at the characters within the documentary, you have Federica, obviously, who is insight into sort of the medical humanitarian crisis, right? Leopoldo Lopez as representative of like some of the political issues with on the sort of higher level, right? Nixon being more of the issues of like the more grassroots political problems, and then Randall, which is sort of like day-to-day sort of economic issues of just trying to make ends meet, in an economy with an economy that's collapsing. So we set out to find these individuals, and obviously Federica, because of her work in the Green Cross, was an ideal candidate for that role. And initially Federica, as she's, the political issues around this are obvious, right? Anyone who's documenting what's going on with this, the idea that it could be used for political purposes is very much at the forefront of everyone's mind, especially within Venezuela. And so, it took us a little bit to work with Federica to assure her that her role was strictly going to stay within the humanitarian medical issue. And then once we kind of developed that trust, we were able to follow her a lot more. Tamara's name kind of came up through, again, when you're looking at this type of issue, right? And there are the certain examples like White Helmets, which maybe stick to sort of a completely cinema verite style, where it's like you're completely on the ground and there's very little large picture contextualization. But that was not necessarily something we wanted to do for our project. We felt that because the story of Venezuela was such a big issue, and we felt that the issue was people tended to minimize the crisis in Venezuela as opposed to understand the extent of it. We wanted to have some of those large scale, large big picture views, which is why we were looking for experts who could speak on that. And so Tomato was like, it was crazy because we were like talking to people like, who do you know? Who do you know? Who do you know? Trying to find someone who felt, as unbiased as possible, but who could give us, who knew what was going on. What's going on in Venezuela tends to polarize people, and they tend to go really far on one side or the other. So we wanted to find someone who could say what was the situation without necessarily getting too carried away with one of the existing narratives of like pro-capitalism, pro-socialism, Latin American independence versus, against US intervention. So anyway, so Tamara was one of those candidates that came up, and she's just perfect, especially working with the organization that she does, which is well known for its work. And you see, you can give her performance or her testimony in the documentary is even, right? It's not too crazy on the other end. So that was really what we were looking for. And Tamara, thankfully, despite being an extremely busy person, was able to give us the time to do it. We caught her like, Tamara being
was flying back from the border from Venezuela and Colombia, and we actually filmed in Bogota. It was like,
yeah. She was like, I've got 2 hours, and we were like, we'll take it.
No, if I could add to that, I actually met Federica before the film or during the film, but before it was actually published, because my job is to document the situation of human rights in Venezuela. And I talked to a lot of people. And Federica and I had been in touch when we were documenting the humanitarian situation, and Federica was one of my sources. Long time, remember Federica?
Yes, of course.
It strikes me how, just by this conversation between Federica and Tamara, between the two of you, how things are, so connected and in a way entangled in Venezuela. And I mean, I want Federica and Tamara, if you can talk about it, but I actually want to start with Max. I mean, how do you start coming into Venezuela? How do you start kind of like pulling out the different threads and understanding the dynamic between things, understanding not only how problems are interconnected, but also people are talking to each other and leading to each other, how one problem informed another. How do you do it as a filmmaker? And then Tamara and Federica, I would be very interested for you to tell me, how do you do it as people working in this space and trying to, make life better in a way in such a tangled um, it's in such a tangled situation? Yeah.
To answer my part, how you start to figure that out, it's especially in the case of Venezuela, I would say it you don't figure it out until you've already been in it for a little while and sort of teaches you through experience. Going into the project, we did as much research as humanly possible on the history of Venezuela, on all the news coverage and what was going on. And that gives you an idea, but it's not until you really start interacting with people on the ground and following them that you kind of get an understanding of how things work. And that's in large part why, Nelson, who I co-directed the project with, he's Venezuelan. He had a large network down there, and they of filmmakers and people who've been living through the crisis, and they understand how it works, right? So we had to step back in a lot of ways, and empower our crew and our team down in Venezuela to help us navigate this and understand we told them generally from a storytelling perspective and from a coverage perspective what we really needed, and give them some more creative artistic direction. But some of the more tangible, like, okay, this is interesting, this is how we have to do, or this is what people we should focus, or this is someone, these are events we should cover. No, don't talk to those people. Those types of things. We had to really follow their lead because, again, it's really hard to understand it as an outsider, not having lived it on the ground. Even, Nelson, having grown up there, he hadn't lived there in a while. And so things had changed dramatically since his time there. So I think you learn on the job a little bit. And you just have to learn very quickly and just be very sensitive to the people who you're working with, and trust that they know what they're doing. I think a lot of other documentaries in our genre, kind of the filmmakers have to employ a similar strategy, which is finding locals, for example, I can draw on the White Helmets example again, finding local filmmakers, finding local people who live there, speak, in addition to speaking the language, understand the current climate politically and socially, and then are able to navigate that and confer that upon you, right? And again, it takes a lot of trust with your subjects. I mean, Federica, like I said, it took us some amount of time before Federica was like, okay, like this is okay, like this is something I'm willing to engage in because I trust you. And that takes time, you know what I mean? Like you start rolling the cameras and you start meeting these people, but it doesn't, that doesn't mean really anything until they're willing to let you into their world a little bit more, and that doesn't happen from day one. So it's timing, it's sensitivity to what's going on, and then I think empowering people who are on the ground and who are a little bit more familiar with the situation, and allowing them to kind of guide you a little bit.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for all the time I took, but I also feel really grateful because you understood the situation we are in, and like you took the time and the patience to put everything in order, just that so it could be perfect and not be as dangerous as something else could have been. It's hard. I think the film is everything in Venezuela. It was kind of 6 degrees of separation when you're connected with all of the people and you don't even know it. And the good thing, and the thing that I like the most, is that I could see how this crisis and any crisis and the harsh moments we lived brought up the best in people, because we had troubles with feeding our volunteers. Then mothers from my school were like preparing all these meals every night for us to eat. Then I had trouble because we needed to find a lawyer because of a legal problem, and like legal advice on how to act when we were on the streets and we had to contact the police or anybody that would come nearby. Then we have friends that said, well, I can help with the legal part, and journalists that were coming, and we said, like, please don't be so political because we want to stick with the health system part. So they would agree. So everybody's like trying to help on their own way. And I think that's the beautiful part about all of this.
What I would add to that is I think it's, in a case like Venezuela, it's inevitable that things are very intertwined, the politics and the humanitarian aspect, from the extreme in which the authorities have detained humanitarian actors. There's a clear link there between the repression and the humanitarian response, but everything is very politicized. So I think one of the main challenges of a film like this is to tell these different stories without contaminating the humanitarian story with the politics behind it. And it's very difficult, and I think the film does a good job doing that. And that is very relevant also when you think about moving forward, what can we do or what needs to be done? And, Venezuela needs free and fair elections and a transition back to democracy, and ensure that political parties can participate in the ballot. And, there's a lot of things that need to be done in that area. But there's also an enormous need for humanitarian aid to reach the country, and it has to be apolitical, because you don't want the politics to make it harder for the aid to reach the country, because while the political dispute is going on, people are dying. So, this separation in terms of telling the story in an objective way and leaving the politics behind is super important also moving forward, like in thinking what can be done. And one of the reasons why I like the film, and I've, Federica and I were just teasing before starting that we've been traveling around the world via Zoom with these presentations. But I think from my perspective, from the work I do, this is a very important way of telling the world what is happening in Venezuela. And going back to the fatigue, we were talking about earlier, is like, what we want and we need to avoid is people getting used to a country being a mess like Venezuela is and not doing anything about it.
You mentioned that you've been traveling the world via Zoom with the film, and I wanted to ask you, often when filmmakers come and present their work in the festival, the Israeli audience asks them, how did the domestic audience respond to the film? So I guess that's also something I want to ask you, but I also want to ask, what did you take out of the different conversations that the film provoked in other places? And I guess this question is, well, all three of you, but maybe especially to Tamara and Federica. I mean, were you able to find some kind of a reflection from other places that helped you to see differently the situation in Venezuela? And just to say that I asked this because it often happened to us, and I get very moved when it happened to us here in Israel, that people bring a film to the audience in Israel, and all of a sudden this film that happened somewhere else and speaks about a different situation, put this mirror to ask people in Israel. Definitely, to a certain degree, we felt this way with your film, and it's such a powerful moment where we can learn from, where there is this knowledge that transpasses, or this knowledge of the world that transpasses through documentary film. So just to say, my question is, what did you learn or what did you gain from these interactions with all these viewers in other places of the world that perhaps are going through similar difficulties?
I don't know if Tamara wants to go first.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. My internet is not very good. I'm not listening to you.
We hear you very well.
Okay, so I go first?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the movie, it was amazing for me to understand how many people from outside Venezuela didn't really know what was going on. And these are the ways in which we can share what's happening and raise awareness and like let the world know, hey, this is happening, this is really happening. So it's really touching when someone gets to you and says like, oh my God, I didn't have any idea that this was going on. This situation that is so hard and so many people are dying or living in the worst conditions ever. So I mean, it's really emotional when they get to you and say, here I am, I'm going to share this, I'm going to raise awareness for you, because that's the most valuable thing that they can give us, like raising awareness, sharing the voice. So it's really touching. And also from the film itself, it was amazing to look at what is happening from other perspectives than mine as a doctor or as in the healthcare system, but to get to know other people who are living the same situation but from different angles. And it's like, whoa, I live it this way, but these other people are having trouble with this and this. So that was the best part, to get to know how others are living the situations and overcoming it.
To me, the film touches on all these different issues, and it just shows how complex Venezuela's crisis is. And then when you travel around the world via Zoom, you know, some people may connect to a little part of this story because they live in a country or come from a country where there is political repression, or now everyone is more moved by the humanitarian aspect of things or the health systems because the world is living a pandemic. But before that, not every country had that issue. Or, you know, if you live in certain European countries, you may be more moved about, you know, issues related to refugees. And Venezuela has everything, you know, it has like every different angle of all these crises. So my feeling is like you always find a way to connect to your audience, because there, you know, there's so many problems to choose from that there's one that people will feel linked to. But and then the other thing I would say is, like, a lot of people ask, you know, and what can we do, and why is this something that I should care about? Because Venezuela, for some audiences, you know, Israel is a country with a lot of immigration from Latin America, from different parts of the world. But for a lot of audiences, this is like very removed. So, you know, how can I connect to that, and how can I do something about this? And I agree with Federica that this film just does that. It allows us to take the issue of Venezuela to different parts of the world so that it's not forgotten, and that we continue to bring pressure on Venezuelan authorities to revert the situation in the country.
Max, what did it mean for you to bring the film to different parts of the world?
So I think it's interesting because I think from my perspective, because I don't live in Venezuela. I'm Colombian. I have a lot of family there, but I don't live in Venezuela, and I don't have any family directly living there. So I think I'm a little more removed from it in an interesting way. Not necessarily because I don't care. I mean, I could go on and on about the emotional attachment that I've developed to Venezuela through the process of making this film. But I do think that it's interesting when you come to a subject as an outsider and then you start to try to understand it, convey it, become attached to it. And then through your own process of attachment, you believe that the rest of the world needs to and will be attached to that same thing because you're showing and putting everything into this documentary that shows what's going on. And I think in the process of sharing it, I've learned that that's not necessarily always true, right? And documentaries and just films of this nature in the current climate straddle this gap of activism, art, and entertainment. And I think that it's really hard because you're creating a product essentially, but a piece of work that has to balance all three of those things. And it's really hard because I think for me, I love the film, and I think it means so much to me, and I wanted to have overwhelming impact, and I think it has in a lot of ways actually, with a lot of people that I know here in the States who are trying to understand it. But at the same time, I want more stories to be coming out about Venezuela and more things, but because I think there's so many other issues that are happening, right? There's like because of the rate at which issues are developing. Like I think almost Venezuela is starting to lose its time in the limelight, and that's the fatigue that I think Tamara is going through. So I think for me, I guess it's creatively and as a filmmaker, it was a wonderful thing. I think as like a person who cares about Venezuela, it's a little heartbreaking to have become so attached to something and then be putting it out into the world and it kind of like coming up and then fading, and still what's going on in Venezuela persists. I urge, it's interesting how topics of social and economic importance can come out of popularity as if it's some sort of like fad, and I worry that Venezuela suffered from that for a little while. And when I have these conversations with people and with audiences after having them seeing the piece, it's always like, I think my thing is always saying like, well, please don't forget about what's going on in Venezuela. Like, don't just watch this film and be like, man, that was emotional and that's crazy, and I can talk about it at my next conversation I'm having. But remember it, look it up, stay current with what's going on, and if you can donate, if you can have it be a factor when you're looking at candidates to elect an office for their foreign policy objectives and everything, I think that is something that I hope endures in people who view it. And it's just yeah, and it will for me. But again, my attachment to this is so deep and intense that I just hope that people who view it are also able to come away with that. So I don't know. So I guess I don't know how well that answered your question, but I think it just brings up a lot of issues for me about how we interact with content about serious issues in our daily life. And we have to choose to an extent what we value and what we find the most important. And I hope more people choose Venezuela, is all I'm saying. Yeah.
I mean, we are approaching the end of the thing, and I do want to ask just like one quick last question, all of you. But before that, just to speak directly to what you were saying, actually, last year we also showed a film about Venezuela. It was called Once Upon a Time in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And I was also the person doing the conversation with the filmmakers afterward. And I do need to say that for me, at least, as a programmer for this film festival that shows many films that speak about human rights issues and humanitarian crisis, Venezuela come across as a space of urgency right now. And I do hope, now with COVID, I think that, also the experience of meeting audiences and getting their feedback and see that they care is somehow compromised. So just to reflect that at least for me, as someone who sees quite a few documentaries, I think your film does like a beautiful work in showing all the complexity of the problems, but also how urgent they are. Mm. And I wanted to ask you just a small question, but a very important one before we say goodbye. And my question is about hope. What is the space of hope you find in Venezuela or for Venezuela today? I think hope is something so important, especially in spaces of crisis.
I think that, sorry, Max.
Go. No, you go.
Okay. I think that a lot of Venezuelans, if you ask this question, they're going to say like, no, I lost hope like a long time ago. But at the end, in the bottom, we're all hoping to have the same country that we had 10, 15 years ago, or maybe not the same, but a new country that gives us the opportunities and the tools to develop and to have a good life and to grow as persons, as professionals. I think that's not gone at all. If you ask any of the Venezuelans who have fled the country, they will, well, I think that most of them will say, I would love to go back. Of course, not in this situation, not in this really hard crisis that we're going through, but they would hope to go back and build this new country with all these opportunities and tools to grow and have a beautiful country again.
What I would add to that is this is a long-term process. You know, I've been documenting the situation in Venezuela for over a decade, and things have gotten worse before they start getting better. So I think it's, you know, we do need to look at this as a long-term investment. And it's sometimes hard to remain hopeful in that context. But I would say that, you know, the film contributes to giving this visibility. There are a lot of things going on internationally that has put Venezuela at the agenda, with the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, the Security Council in New York, the Organization of American States in Washington, capitals in Latin America, in Spain. So I do think that, you know, today, due to the pressure and the relevance that this has given, these organizations and governments have given to the crisis in Venezuela, the Maduro authorities, the government of Venezuela, is as isolated as it's ever been on a lot of different levels. And they've been pressured into adopting certain measures, like starting to accept humanitarian aid. Very recently, they adopted a reform of the electoral authority that includes 2 opposition people in a 5-body electoral authority. They have allowed the World Food Program to enter Venezuela for the first time in many years. So there's some evidence of concessions that haven't had before. There's probably a new round of negotiations between the opposition and the government coming up. So I do think that, you know, the pressure has helped, moved things into a situation in which a transition to democracy may be possible. But this is a long-term investment. So I think the hope needs to be understood in terms of, you know, what can you expect in the short term and what are we fighting for in the medium term?
I mean, for me, the hope thing is just, again, I think my attachment to Venezuela, part of what created that is not just, you know, being exposed to the subject matter, but getting to know Venezuelans and the community that they have. It's very, I'm not gonna say unique, because I'm sure other countries have it as well, but I will say that, and I make this comment pretty frequently, but you get Venezuelans that have never met each other, and you put them into a room, and they're already they're connected. There's a bond. You know what I mean? For whatever reason, it's totally nuts, but they're just like already just like, oh yeah, like, and then they start talking, and then they like went to high school together, or they're like parents or friends or something. It's crazy. No, it's amazing. And they're all about helping other Venezuelans continue to do whatever it is they need to do, whether that's exist in a career in the arts or whatever they need to do, find ways to get money to family members. So I think what gives me hope is knowing that how hard Venezuelans work, but also how much they're committed to each other and their country, just on like a very deep level. They like, Venezuelans love Venezuela, they love each other, and they want it to be okay. And I think that is the type of thing that gets countries out of these issues, right? It's not the people who say, screw it, I'm out of here, this place is a mess, I'm going to go try to figure out my life somewhere else. Maybe some are saying that temporarily, but they all say that with the intention of returning and trying to make things better to go back home. And I think that makes Venezuela different than, I think, other countries that may perhaps suffer that issue. And I think that's what gives me hope for Venezuela to get out of this. And I believe it will, because they're just a group of people who love their country, love their home, and want to go back.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I think we will end with this hope and also with this trust in the people rather than other maybe structures in society. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for bringing the film to us here in Israel, in Doc Aviv. It's so important to see it, especially here. And I wanted once again to thank you also for Tamara and Federico for your everyday activity for Venezuela and for Venezuela.
Thank you for giving us the space to share this.
Thank you.
Thank you.